Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I am your host, Kyle, and today I have a clarifying episode that links back to our most recent episode on serfdom. So, like I said in that, we're going to be covering the Pugachev Rebellion. So, the Pugachev Rebellion is one of the biggest and most famous rebellions kind of all time in Russia, particularly in the 1700s, and led to quite a bit of change within how serfdom worked, or at least legal change. In reality, the kind of day-to-day of it didn't change a whole lot, and a lot of these legal changes didn't really result in much, but it did result in some changes. Particularly, there were the creation of what were called peasant courts, and this was a place where peasants could come and air their grievances against their landlords and maybe even get some kind of recourse. But all of that is covered in the previous episode on how that does and doesn't really work. But so today we're going to be talking less about serfdom and more about a man named Yemelyan Pugachev, who was born in 1742 and then died in 1775. So not a particularly long run, but we'll talk about it because it's a particularly important one. So, who was Yemelyan Pugachev? First and foremost, he was a Don Cossack. So, who are the Cossacks? We'll get into that a little bit more kind of partway through this, but the main thing to be aware of is the Cossacks are a group of semi-nomadic horsemen who live in Eastern Europe, like in Ukraine, Poland, southern Russia, that area, and then in Siberia, particularly kind of southern Siberia, places like Kazakhstan, for example, because the Russian word for Cossack is Kazakh. So Kazakhstan would be the land of the Cossacks. And so why are these people in kind of very wildly different areas? Well, basically what it comes down to is the people of Eastern Europe, I guess, Central Europe, I don't know, that area, Ukraine area, they were instrumental to the taking over of far Eastern Europe and Western Northern Asia, because these people were very autonomous. They had a lot of freedom within the Russian system to move around, to own arms, to kind of do what they wanted, and they were relied on quite a bit by the government as not necessarily mercenaries, because they were loyal to the Russian government, sort of, more or less, but they weren't really paid to do this. It's kind of a weird situation. Basically, they're more or less allowed to do whatever they want at the edges of the empire, as long as when the wars come, they send their guys to fight, they send money, weapons, whatever. And that is an important relationship for this story. And so they're going east, they're conquering these lands, they're instrumental. I mean, they go basically all the way across the whole damn continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they're bringing in a lot of these new territories, and they're spreading their kind of Cossack ways, which work really well out in Central Asia. These are kind of the steppes of Asia. We're at the very edges of them here in Siberia, but still going into Kazakhstan, the other Central Asian countries, which there is going to be quite a bit of presence of these Cossacks. Their lifestyle, semi-nomadic horsemen, is already in practice. It's already kind of a thing out there, and so, hey, it's great for them. Those guys, they kick ass out there. Not just in the kind of sense of they're winning battles and fighting, but also, like, they just do really well for themselves out there. It suits them. So, now we get where these guys are. We have Cossacks in Central Asia, Northern Asia, farthest Eastern Europe, and then we have Cossacks in farthest Western Eastern Europe, like, again, Ukraine. And that is where Pugachev is from. He is from the area around the Don River, which is in very far western Russia, near the border with Ukraine, which is why he is a Don Cossack. So, as a Cossack, he is coming up in a group of people who are very independent, who have a culture of freedom and general kind of unhierarchicalness. It's quite a bit more democratic, it's quite a bit more even and leveled than the incredibly hierarchical Russian imperial system. This is a group of people, the Cossacks, who are known for their kind of inclusiveness. Not everyone, there's some serious issues with the Cossacks and Jews, but that is going to be for a later date. For now, they're fairly inclusive of who can come in, and they're fairly welcoming of all peoples. Basically, everyone is more or less equal, and they elect a leader to rule them. This is incredibly free and incredibly different in comparison to the very hierarchical, very autocratic Russian imperial system. As well, Pugachev is a old believer, or well, he's born into a family of old believers, and we will do more about the old believers later. That's actually going to be the episode for next week, spoiler alert. And the long and short of them is the old believers are a kind of puritanical splinter group off of the Russian Orthodox Church. And the main thing to remember about these guys, at least for this context, is they are incredibly anti-government. They have been seriously oppressed by the Russian government, and so growing up in a Cossack old believer family might breed somebody who's not entirely a big fan of the government and who's not entirely a big fan of being controlled. But he would ultimately be part of the Russian machine as much as basically anyone else would. So he ends up being a part of the military, and he fights in the 7 Years' War, he fights in Russian campaigns in Poland, and he fights in the Russo-Turkish War. The man spends absolute ages fighting for the Russian Empire, and he actually gets injured while he's fighting. After being injured, he returns home to recover. And while he was recovering, he spent about 3 years just kind of wandering around in Russia, meeting people and going to different places and seeing what life was like. He spent the majority of his time with the old believers. And I should have said this previously, but the Russian term for old believers are staroviershi. So he's spending a lot of time with the old believers, and they are talking to him about, like, hey man, this place kind of sucks out here. We're really getting hammered on. We're really getting oppressed. And here's actually some more information you might be interested about. And they tell him about the Yaik or Ural Cossacks. And the reason I say Yaik or Ural is it used to be known as the Yaik Mountains, now the Ural Mountains. So it changed. There's a town that also changed names, which we'll get to in a second. So if I say Yaik or Ural, I mean the same thing. So he learns about the Yemelyan Cossack Rebellion in 1772 and how it got incredibly repressed. These guys got absolutely crushed. And he actually went to go join his fellow Cossacks in the town of Yatisky Gorodok, now the town of Ural. And on his way, he was arrested for deserting the army, because even though he'd already served, years in the army and had been injured, you're not allowed to leave. Once the Russian army has its claws in you, you are not going anywhere. Well, I guess that's not entirely true, because, well, they just deported him to Siberia. They said, you know what, we're done with you. And this was fairly common. If the military, government, whoever, you pissed them off, they would just send you to Siberia. And, well, the thought was, we need people to go to Siberia to establish buildings, build towns, do whatever. Also, the thought is, might just die out there. It's pretty miserable, and you'll be very, very far away from the center of power. The one problem with this thought, and this is a theme that will become apparent, I think, over the course of this entire series, because he will not be the only person to do literally this. He just turns back around and comes back, because Siberia is massive. It is a gigantic place, and to control all the people out there, which would be millions of people, would be ostensibly impossible. There's just too much space, there's too many people, and the border between European and Asian Russia is just too damn big. I'm not exactly sure how big it is, but it's gotta be thousands of miles. And you got the Ural Mountains right there. It's gonna be hard to stop everyone, it's gonna be hard to control everything. And so ultimately, they just can't. And that, like I said before, is a pretty serious theme in Russian history, that people get sent to Siberia, and they say, okay, now stay there. And then they just don't, because, like, who's gonna stop him? And so that's exactly what he does. In 1773, Pugachev's back. He's on the other side of the Ural Mountains, and he is claiming to be Peter III, who is the dead husband of Catherine the Great, which is a little bit awkward, because Catherine the Great's in power, and Catherine the Great totally murdered that guy. So, not a great look for her. So now Pugachev is back as Peter III, and he's ready to really fuck some shit up. I mean, he is about to pop off something truly insane. So, what he does is he declares himself Tsar. Because he's not just Peter III in name, he's Peter III. He's like, I'm the Tsar, and you guys gotta listen to me. And he does two things that are particularly popular, or unpopular, depending on which side of this you are on. So, he declares serfdom abolished. Peter III, anti-Tsar, has just freed the serfs. He also has said, it's time to kill landlords. Which, again, depending on what side you're on, this all sounds great, or, oh my god, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. And then, if you're on the other side of this, if you're looking at the business end of this, it gets worse. Because Peter III is not just some resurrected ghost, I don't know, like living out in the woods. Nope, Peter III, or Pugachev, has an army. A fairly large one. Tens of thousands of people are going to be in this army at its peak. He is incredibly popular. And what this comes down to is, this time in Russia, the 1770s, is not a great time to be a Russian person. If you are Catherine the Great or her buddies, it's a great time to be a Russian person. But if you are literally anyone else, yeah, it sucks. It is horrible, because Catherine the Great gets her name as the Great, not because she's out here, oh yeah, we're making friends, we're making all the Russian people happy. No, fuck that. No, she's an empress. That's not how you make yourself the Great. No, she's having wars. She is strangling the Russian peasant for every ounce of money and wealth and labor that she can get out of them in every context. Like, look at Pugachev's military record. He's fought in 3 different wars now, and the man only lives for like 33 years. So he is just absolutely being crushed under this, and so is everyone else. This is not a great time to be a Russian peasant. Granted, there's not a lot of times it's great to be a Russian peasant, but this is a particularly bad one, which is always kind of interesting, because we look back at Catherine the Great and we're like, hey, the Great. Well, great for a very, 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 very limited number of people. For everyone else, 2 thumbs down. So, Pugachev, or Peter III, as I'm going to be calling him just because I find that kind of fun. So Peter III is really, really popular, because people didn't like serfdom. And this was a time where serfdom was really, really being kind of pushed down onto the people. This is not long after Peter the Great, another guy named Great because he sucked to the average man, but, made Russia very wealthy. He passed all of these laws that said the serfs aren't allowed to go anywhere, they're not allowed to own property, and they're not allowed to, have any kind of representation with the people who run them. Believe it or not, that's not popular. And people don't like being serfs, and people don't like the fact that serfdom is going everywhere. As the Russian Empire expands, serfdom's coming with it. People don't like that they are serfs, and they don't like that they have even fewer rights as serfs than they used to. They also don't like that there's incredibly heavy taxes to fund the wars, because just because you're a serf doesn't mean you're not paying your taxes, man. No one likes that. As well, with all these wars, there's increased conscription. Which, again, you're already a serf, you're already paying your taxes, and now you gotta go fight in Turkey? What the fuck, man? This stuff sucks. Nobody wants to do this shit. Well, it doesn't really matter. Because, like we learned with Peter III, once you're in the military, they own your ass, and you go where they tell you, you do what they tell you. If they say jump, you ask how high, and you're gonna do it for 20 plus years. So, people are really not having a great time. And then you get into the issues of religious and ethnic persecution. The Old Believers are a big supporter of this rebellion, and they don't like the government because they're being repressed by the government. They're being pushed to the absolute edges of the empire by government violence and repression. and they're just like, fuck this, man. This guy's fighting a war. Yeah, let's go fight us a war. The Cossacks are also in very much so the same boat because, as I was saying before, they were originally a very independent, very mobile group of people, but especially after the Yemelyan Rebellion, the Cossacks are really feeling the clamps on themselves too. They're like, hey, we used to be able to move around, we used to be able to own more property, own weapons, have a lot more autonomy, and now you're saying, no, 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 no. You guys got to go into the military. 20-year conscriptions. And they're like, well, we were already in the military. They said, nope, too bad. You're coming in more. We're clamping down. You can't move around as much. You can't own property as much. You are not allowed to kind of be the way you've always been. Which for a kind of semi-nomadic group is not just like, oh, damn, that's a bummer, but that's a serious part of their cultural identity. So they're not happy. And then in the area where Peter III comes in, just west of the Ural Mountains near Kazakhstan, there are a lot of Bashkir Muslims. And they're going through a very similar process with the government in Moscow. They've kind of always been at the very edge of the empire. They're kind of out there in the middle of nowhere, and for the most part, the Russian imperial government has left them alone and kind of let them do whatever they want. Much like the Cossacks, they're kind of semi-autonomous. And now, all of a sudden, Russian troops are showing up. Russian troops are saying, hey, you got to do this, you got to do that. They're having the same kind of taxation issues. They're being imposed on the same kind of serfdom issues. They are being drafted in the military, and they are not happy about it. They'd always worn the yoke of Russian imperialism fairly lightly in comparison, and now all of a sudden, with the expansion of the power of the Russian imperial state and government, that's not the case. So they're going to throw their lot in as well. So just to go over, we have peasants, we have Cossacks, we have Bashkirs, and we have the Old Believers. All of these people are upset because the state is just crushing them into powder for, 6 more inches of territory in Turkey, or a couple more pieces of gold, or just whatever the hell it is they want out of them, because they are ostensibly just property of the government. So, tens of thousands of people are going to ultimately join this rebellion, and it's not going to go particularly well. Little spoiler alert, we're in the year 1773. Pugachev dies in 1775. So, he's got 2 years, which for a peasant uprising is pretty impressive, though it doesn't go particularly impressive. So, the war begins with Pugachev besieging the towns of Ufa and Orenburg. These are towns near the Ural Mountains, near Kazakhstan, not that far away from Kazan. So they're definitely at kind of the edge of the Russian Moscow mindset, but they're surprisingly close as well. And again, they got tens of thousands of dudes, and they are besieging these 2 towns, which these are definitely provincial towns. They're not like, oh my god, they're at the gates of St. Petersburg or Moscow or something. But this is still fairly frightening. Particularly what is frightening is in this area, again, there are a lot of Bashkir Muslims, and it's impossible for the Russian government to muster a local force to put this down. They have to mobilize the army, the whole damn thing, to go put this rebellion down. And that is something particularly scary to Catherine the Great, because not only is this, oh my god, there's a force of people who are threatening me and threatening my system, but they are popular enough, they are influential enough, that their proposed kind of anti-system is drawing people away from the military, from the established system. Not only are these guys like a physical threat to my safety, they are a kind of ideological threat to the very concept of this empire. So she cracks down, and she cracks down hard. Especially once nobility starts showing up in Moscow and St. Petersburg saying, oh my god, guys, out there it is absolute anarchy. The serfs are just running amok. There are Old Believers and Muslims everywhere. Everything is just terrifying. So she calls in the regulars. Now the Russian military has been mobilized and is going to go fuck up Pugachev and his boys. So she sends a guy named General A.I. Bibikov, who defeats Pugachev at Tatishevo in the spring of 1774. But Pugachev survives, and actually burns the city of Kazan to the ground in July of 1774, which is pretty impressive. What's also pretty impressive is Pugachev never actually wins a battle. He just keeps surviving after defeat, because he gets defeated again, and then he survives, and he crosses the Volga River. He just keeps going west somehow, which is insane. He just keeps escaping and moving west. So his thought was he was going to link up with the Don Cossacks, and he could get them to join him. If he could get close enough to the western expanses of Russia, he could bring in the Don Cossacks, and they were going through a lot of the same stuff as the Yait Cossacks and as the Bashkirs, and just everyone. No one's having a good time. So he's like, I can get those guys. They're my guys. They'll join me. So he captures the town of Saratov and then begins to besiege the town of Tsaritsyn, or Volgograd. He's at Volgograd. He's pretty damn close to Moscow. This is fairly surprising. But unfortunately for Pugachev, he is defeated for the last time in September of 1774 by a guy named A.V. Suvorov. But he doesn't die. Nope. Pugachev is still on the run. But unfortunately for him, things are not kind of the way they once were. This massive army of tens of thousands of people is crumbled. It doesn't really exist anymore. Not any more than kind of if I were to go stand out in my backyard and say, I am an army. Because he doesn't really have anyone left, and the Russian Imperial military, while it is not maybe necessarily the most technologically advanced thing in the world, not compared to maybe some other more technologically advanced militaries out there, it's still a proper army. No one's out here going, well, it's just some dudes with, sticks. No. That's much more Pugachev's deal. These are guys with guns, cannons, horses, the whole 9 yards. And this is just a technological hurdle that Pugachev couldn't get over. But seemingly his mortal coil, his very existence on this plane, was something that the Russian government could never really figure out, because he survives. He escapes this battle. And the Yait Cossacks actually end up saying, okay, man, this is enough. We've had enough. This isn't going anywhere. And they betray him. They take him hostage and they send him off to Moscow. And, well, you can probably guess what happens to Pugachev. He did, in fact, start one of the largest revolutions in the Russian Empire. Not just to date, but, ever. And also, to note, this is one revolution at a time of revolutions. There are quite a few rebellions that had been going on prior and even after this that, while not at the same kind of tenor, were similar. There were quite a few rebellions, and a lot of them were centered around Cossacks. And interestingly enough, a lot of them were also centered around Old Believers. So you can probably guess what happens to our buddy Pugachev. He's one of these people. He's a Cossack. He's an Old Believer. He's from, not the areas that are kind of, favorable within the Russian imperial mind. He's not a particularly important person from a Russian imperial standpoint. He's not like nobility or something. And he did just lead one of the most successful rebellions and one of the largest rebellions against the Russian imperial system. That, while it never really, put the Russian Empire on the back foot, it really scared the shit out of them. So they murdered him. Yep, they executed him in 1775 on January 21st. So, unfortunately for Pugachev, and unfortunately for all those who were in his army, this would not be the end of their toil. It would not be the end of their strife. Instead, they would go on to toil in the fields and be continually oppressed, forced into military service, what have you, until, basically till the Soviet Union in 1917. And then, in a lot of ways, it was just kind of a different beast after that. It was much the same thing, but it's kind of under a new name. So, kind of a bummer of an ending, but kind of an interesting story and kind of a, I don't know, I find it kind of a little cathartic, I guess, in a way, after last week's kind of real bummer of a story. I don't know how much of a bummer it was for y'all, but it was a real bummer for me to read, write, and talk about. I'm not a big fan of those kinds of stories, but it's an important story, so I think that this is a good kind of palate cleanser because everybody likes a good rebellion. Everybody likes, the masses standing up for themselves and fighting against those who oppress them. And, well, this is something that the Russians kind of do a lot of. A lot of people like to talk about how Russia's an autocratic, despotic state. And to be fair, it has been for basically forever. But nobody ever really likes to talk about how the Russian people respond to that. They don't just lie down and take it. No, as a matter of fact, they tend to get pretty angry. And when the Russian people get pretty angry, shit seems to get done. No, it's not always the best shit, but, something happens. And so that's what this story is about. This is the story of, really an untold story of the Russian people being pushed too far and responding in exactly how you might expect them to. And as I said before, this is not the only rebellion that was going on at that time, and of course it would not be the only rebellion that would ever take place in the Russian Empire or in the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation for that matter. It is a very important one, and we will get to some of those other ones later. But for now, I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave me a review, leave me a like, whatever. Any kind of interaction with the show is really great because it lets me know what you like, what you don't like, and also, of course, it does drive traffic to the show. But I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.